Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to New Kent County's live Facebook show. Uh, my name is David Hill, and I'm with a company called Hill Studio, and my company and Aaron Arnett with Arnett Muldrow, as well as a number of our colleagues with Hill Studio and Arnett Muldrow, and even Andy Kalbach and partners have been working this last 2 weeks on the Envision New Kent County Strategic Plan. And today we would like to share with you some of the products of our design workshop. It's important to remember that the New Kent County Strategic Plan is a work in progress, and that we took the last 2 weeks to really drill down on some of the special issues that might be best solved with the design and planning team. And we've all been working socially distancing, not a typical design charrette, but instead in our own places, working on a number of strategies. This slide here indicates the 5 general categories that will be discussed in the New Kent County Strategic Plan. And our workshop has really focused on the ones that we have circled here. That is, issues that deal with growth, particularly land management and design, and issues that deal with quality of life, particularly rural character. And even though we might touch on some of these other topics that you see on this general board of some of the big issues of New Kent County's strategic plan, we really tried to focus on this difficult sort of cluster here in the middle, because we thought by perhaps proposing some planning and design techniques, we might be able to sort of bring them to the fore. Now, what you'll see today is still a work in progress, and we would appreciate anybody as we go through the show. Please provide your comments, and if and this will be left up on the website, so you're welcome to provide your comments later if you're not watching us as we go live. So so this is step 5 of our 2-week workshop. In the very first part of last week, we discussed what is rural character and what are the important areas for managing growth. Later last week, we got into balancing rural character and development and started to scratch the surface of what should development look like to fit in appropriately with New Kent County. So today, we're going to discuss a little bit further developing these concepts. Can we guide growth and development in a strategic way for New Kent County? So some of the strategies that we would like to share with you today, and it's really starting just to focus us here, is can we cluster development in future development in New Kent County to preserve the countryside? Can we cluster the development to make utility extensions much more manageable? Can we provide amenities, particularly public amenities, in these development clusters? Can we incentivize rural landscape preservation? Can we provide community facilities across the county and improve them, particularly in the categories of parks, Wi-Fi hotspots, and maybe public safety? And then finally, particularly because of the amount of Interstate 64 that traverses the county, can we make New Kent County more attractive to the traveling public? So, words are a lot of words, but this picture may be worth 1,000 words, which is, can you cluster development to preserve the countryside? And so in this illustration, what we see is a densely developed village here in the lower left side. And it has a lot of the things that you'd like to have in a village. It has sidewalks, it has very carefully planned pedestrian crosswalks, it has places for cars and people, and it has design guidelines that suggest how you might build things. But what's interesting in this picture, and maybe why it's attractive, is that there's an extraordinary landscape and rural countryside beyond. And so if we're going to take the idea and manage development inside of denser areas, we also need to consider how to take care of this beautiful managed American countryside that we see all throughout New Kent County. And so that's what we're going to be trying to address today in a number of different ways. We looked at this series of pictures, and we've been studying this fellow named Randall Arendt this week. Randall is a pioneer, really, in trying to provide ways to develop in rural counties and do it in a way that makes sense and works with the development patterns that are already there. In this drawing, on the left, you see an aerial view of an existing crossroads community. In the center is what would happen if that same crossroads developed in the way that most counties currently have zoning in place, sort of a 2-acre zoning, and you can see how it starts to completely fill that scene. In the right-hand picture, we see village pattern zoning, an alternative to that 2-acre zoning, which clusters the development in villages pretty densely, but it allows the fields and forests to remain beyond. And so Mr. Arendt has provided a good background for us here, and a lot of his principles we'll be sharing with you today. In fact, if you want a textbook on this topic, Rural by Design, Planning Town and Country is a really great book where Mr. Arendt went back and he looked after a couple of decades of consulting towns and villages and counties around the United States, and has gone back and pulled together a number of case studies of very successful examples of communities that have had two things that we see in New Kent County. One is they had extraordinary rural landscapes and scenery, which you have. And the second is they have a very passionate community about this kind of topic, which you have. So a number of the techniques that he discusses in his book will be very important for New Kent County going on beyond our strategic plan as you move into comprehensive plan and some of the documents that later follow. So in your current comprehensive plan, New Kent County has already classified a number of places for growth in hamlets, villages, and crossroads. And you can see it here on the map. You'll see this map. We'll be using this throughout the conversation today. New Kent County is the white area. You see our neighboring counties all around. And then you see Interstate 64 kind of going right up through the middle of the county. The brown areas, there are half a dozen of them, are the villages current villages in New Kent County. The purple areas down here in the southeast are hamlets. And then there are numbered tiny pink dots. These are rural crossroads communities already identified in your comprehensive plan. So we have an existing system in place that we'd like to use to discuss these. Let's talk a little bit about what is in each of these places. What is a village? You know, a village is a place that has, and we're going to go ahead and distinguish this. If you ask 10 different people, you might get 10 different opinions of what a village is. This is our take on a village for this conversation. And in it, you'll have a prominent siting of some public use. Maybe it's a branch library, or maybe it's a fire station, but there's some kind of public component of a village. A village also has public utilities for our intents and purposes. So it gives you a chance to develop it denser. It has an organized sense of identity, dense, compact form with diverse land uses, a variety of building types, and key to this is walk-to commercial buildings. Everything is connected by sidewalks, trails, signage. It'll have a communication hotspot, which is very important, and it tends to be a center of gravity to draw people together. Now, if you've lived in Virginia a while, there's, you know, you've been to a lot of villages. They have these common characteristics. Here, just a refresher, here are our 6 villages of New Kent County. Now let's start to study a village in a little bit more detail. This is one we just dreamed up, and it has in it about 145 houses, for example, and it takes up about 50 acres. So it's pretty dense compared to other rural zoning. And you'll see in the center, we have 3 different districts. One is a village core, which is the tightest. And then we have some village residential, and then finally some outer residential, which are in some conservation areas. Now, you know, this drawing here was done early, and then, you know, we put it over, and you get this sort of beautiful look and feel, and it's sort of like, yeah, that's a village. That's what a village should look like. And so there's an artist depiction here showing, you know, a beautiful village that's very reasonable for the Virginia countryside. So now enjoy that beautiful artist rendering because I'm about to take it apart and show you the pieces and parts of it. So what's a village have? Let's look at it, from a planner's perspective. See this little tall building here? Maybe that's a church or a municipal building. A village has a terminal vista point. So that's sort of planner ease for as you're driving down the road, you can see something at the end that's really kind of a nice feature piece. It also has central common. Maybe it's a park or a playground, but some type of public ground that is available for everybody. A good village also has connectivity. It has greenways that connect it to other villages or hamlets or to the river or to parks and some of the things that you really want to connect to in New Kent County. A village also has denser, diverse uses in the middle. That's what we see surrounded by the red, and you'll see these are like 3-story buildings, 2-story buildings. A village also has gateway corridor. Look up here. One of the keys to keeping a village is to control its tendency to want to grow and sprawl, right? You got to put your village on a diet. And so in this case, a gateway corridor with special zoning to prevent that tendency for sprawl. That might not be the only tool we would use there. There may be other ones, such as ag forestal districts. You can see in the sketch these fields placed in a special ag forestal district, and that also prevents sprawl. And that's also a very healthy system already in place in your county. And then finally, a village may have special codes that would enforce and encourage special building forms and materials. And they may be in several different zones inside the village. So I've taken that nice, pretty artist picture and turned it into a complicated diagram, but it's the stuff that you don't see that is kind of attractive in villages. So a village starts to have, when we bring a village to life, and you get down on the main street, and you really look around, you can really start to see it come to life. And so if you're not tired of me telling you about all these elements yet, you have that central roadway that might focus on some type of important building. Over here you have the park. Here you have the taller multi-story buildings, which might have commercial downstairs and residential up top, multiple uses. We call them live-work buildings because you can live in them, you can work in them. It might have special signage and awning guidelines. It may have required, the way that different retail uses dress the street, for example, outdoor seating, etc. So a lot of the elements of a village you can extract and turn into what we call a form-based codes, which will require certain pieces get built. So here's the thing about a village, and think about it as very different from the way that a lot of non-urban uses get built, is that there's an intentional design relationship between all of the components. The buildings and its relationship to the trees, to the walkways, to the parking, what you're doing with all of your elements and how you place them in a village, they all count. There's no leftover space. It's all very intentional. So that when you get finished, there's a very important relationship between the building and the sidewalk, or how you go under the little arches, for example, or the common here. And the common is greatly strengthened by the fact that you have all these buildings around it, and all eyes are on the common, and there's a little break so you can see something special in the background like a steeple. It's all very carefully planned. And what we'll be doing as we finish our work here with New Kent County and the strategic plan is to put the common elements of a village onto what we call a strategy board, and that'll be handed to the planning department as you move into the comprehensive plan, because this is just sort of outlining the idea, and next with the comprehensive plan you continue to really work the details of it. Now, New Kent Courthouse Village is already identified in the comprehensive plan, and that's a kind of a special village. It's a central hub of the county. It has an extraordinary history. It's an educational and commercial center, and it's a destination. It really deserves some special care. And so if you look at the town or the village of New Kent Courthouse, over here on the right-hand side is really, let me go back, sorry, is is a kind of this is the court and administrative function. Then in the middle is the schools. They have their schools in the ball fields and things like that. Then over here on the left end is a commercial village. So it's kind of got 3 in 1. It's a pretty special place. I'm going to focus for a minute on this judicial and administrative end. When you look at that from the air, here's your county administration building. Here's the courthouse. Right now, there's an immense parking lot right there. And if you look at traditional Virginia courthouse towns, you know, there's sort of a special honor that these places deserve. And even though it's nice to park 3 steps from the door, there are lots of other places that one could park. And so as this village starts to really go forward, you may provide opportunities to better arrange some of these sort of utilitarian things around it. And that also goes for this area up front, the old traditional area around the museum and the old library and the old jail and things like this. This is an extraordinary place that you could remove some of the parking and place instead a sidewalk system that would connect to your greenway system that's already in place, and then better signage, etc., to kind of bring the attention that this place deserves. And finally, as you think about this green and how it might grow in the future, maybe even a few support facilities that go pretty well with this older house that's already turned into a restaurant, but these also may be restaurants or things that support the walkability of this green, maybe commercial. Now, where'd the parking go? We've been pretty subtle about this, but we've added parking in places that are still close to things, but not right in front and center. So it may be just a way to clean this up and bring a little stature to the grounds. Now, Hamlet. A hamlet, this is, by the way, this is a photo of a hamlet in Loudoun County. You know, Loudoun, in a similar way to New Kent County, has been real concerned about quality growth, and so it has some similar characteristics, and also Loudoun has some beautiful hamlets and villages to look at. A couple of hamlets in New Kent County are on your southeast side. Now, what are the characteristics of a hamlet? Hamlet is almost like a junior village. It has buildings grouped to create spaces. It has a sense of identity. It has compact development in a variety of housing types. Just like a village, it has walk-to commercial buildings and good connectivity, and it's a social and communications center. It may not have a public building. It may not have utilities. And so sometimes hamlets would grow to be a village. Other times they're just fine the way they are, and they kind of have a unique, special place. They're just sort of a little low key, not quite the intensity of a village. Okay, so let's just take a look at a typical hamlet in New Kent. And this is one where you might have a divided roadway and a number of small roads coming into it. The little gray squares here indicate the existing development that's already around a hamlet. And so usually, and that's why they were identified last time in the comp plan, is that they are where denser development already is. So as you start to really develop a hamlet to give it better form, you have to think about where you want to guide density and also where you want to prevent it from sprawling. Two things you got to take on at the same time. So in this proposed case, in this case, the designer suggested, well, you can start to cluster the density here. This is where you sort of make the center of your hamlet. And you may take a public building, and place it along the road in a reasonable place so that as people entering the hamlet, there's that sort of welcome to the hamlet. There's a public building there. You see the boulevard is landscaped, so it also sort of starts to bring attention and starts to bring the driver's focus so they slow down into the hamlet. And so the designers in this case have drawn denser buildings in the middle of the hamlet, which you see here with the red roofs. And this also has parking out back, so it's not right in front of everything. It also suggests, well, maybe you do we call it a T&D, or traditional neighborhood development, a little denser subdivision where it has alleys, streets, it has everything so you can walk to the middle of the hamlet. And it also has a smaller green as part of it. But the one thing that you also see emphasized on this are these large areas of forested ground. In this case, these are strategic areas that are that have land use either incentives or zoning to help them stay natural, because the last thing you want is for your hamlet to kind of leak out and sprawl everywhere. You have to keep it contained. So these are strategic parcels that might go into the ag forestal land use pattern, or there may be scenic easement purchased on it so that it does not start to sprawl. And it's coordinated pretty well because these are entrance roads into the hamlet. That's why these are important. Another entrance road in here. And so it's sort of key parcels to consider as part of this whole package. Here's how it starts to look from the air. You can see where the density started to be clustered, areas that are intentionally left preserved, and how it starts to sort of form that central area. You know, in a hamlet, you may start to add sort of centers of activity, sort of to generate body heat, we call it. You know, like a pop-up farmer's market or something like that, something special that happens there at certain times. And even on sleepy times, you try to encourage things like large overhangs, Coke machines, things like this on the porch, so that it kind of is a place where there's activity more and more often. So you try to concentrate that kind of activity. And in this case, you try to do it in that kind of special central zone in the hamlet. And here's the way the hamlet character board that's starting to get put together that will be a part of the final product. Now, crossroads. Here's our smallest of our three traditional forms. And this picture was everybody's favorite in the earlier visual quality tests, and we finally determined it's because of that cute dog there. But seriously, what other people like about this is, you know, see, this is a crossroads in another nearby county, and it has this beautiful kind of old store, and it has a little place where there's an apartment or place where maybe originally the store owners might have lived. Buildings at crossroads tend to be smaller, a little bit more casual, but perform a certain important function for the community. The crossroads, rural crossroads in your county, most of them are along north of the interstate. There's one currently in the south, and this may be a category that in the future, as you do more comprehensive planning, you know, you may add more crossroads. And so, you know, what's a crossroads look like? Well, you have the two roads coming together, and sure enough, somebody's take initiative and put up a store, and usually have a store at a crossroads, and then there's other houses and smaller buildings, and then countryside. So as that crossroads develops, that you got to think of, you know, it's okay with it one store, it's not really much of a problem, but when you start to have them on all four corners, you have to get a little bit more directive in the planning so that it's safe. You don't want entry ramps sliding into the road all over the place. You need to take them and set them back, for example. So you start to see in this crossroads as it's developed, you know, entrance roads are pulled back from this corner and parking behind. You also start to see, you know, a coordinated system of pedestrian circulation with crosswalks. You see screened parking if it's in front of the buildings. And so it's again, it's an organized system. And as we get a little closer in, you know, one of the things that happens with crossroads in Virginia now is that you sometimes they get turned into roundabouts. So you try to make your crossroads so that if it does turn into a roundabout, you don't have to displace a lot of stuff. So you set it back so that it works in, you know, in the future. And so, you know, here's an aerial view of a potential crossroads, a typical crossroads. The existing buildings have gray roofs. New buildings have red roofs so you can tell them apart. You can see the parking is pulled back from that main intersection. You see crosswalks and sort of organized ways to get from one building to another. And then you start to see out here, like the hamlet, there are certain parcels would be reasonable to put into this land use or transfer development rights so that you can contain your crossroads. Otherwise, it sprawls. The crossroads character board being composed, and it'll share all these characteristics kind of in one board. Now, we've talked about some of these traditional forms and new kinds of ways to live and settle in rural counties. One of them, it's been in the United States growing since the 1950s, is the interstate interchange. And like them or not, they exist. And the way that you introduce almost everybody to your county now is that they come to your county and get off Interstate 64 at an interchange. And so your chance to welcome everybody into New Kent County, you're going to have them for about a minute. And to get their attention is to somehow welcome them at that interchange, because that's where they're coming in. So this little sketch here just shows an example of what one community is doing to at its interchange, at its entrances, is to really landscape it, put in some signs or sort of a kit of parts that you can do to make an interchange work. Now, if somebody just said where are the 4 central interchanges in New Kent County, look at that. They're all the way across the county. As you host guests on I-64, this is where they get off and come into your county. 4 different interchanges. Now, how do you apply these same kind of principles to an interchange? Well, you might have a welcoming landscaped boulevard. You may have landscaped business frontages, buildings with architectural character, coordinated sign and lighting standards, dense development patterns, safe pedestrian areas, hidden parking. Sound familiar? A lot of the same principles apply, even though this type of building form is a lot newer than the village and hamlet. Now, I'm always amazed to look at an interchange, and this is just not New Kent County, this is about any interchange, and it's an extraordinarily inefficient land use. Look at this, for example. This is one of your interchanges, and the little yellow squares are outlines of the buildings in that interchange. 240 acres in this picture, about 30,000 square feet of it is in buildings. And a planner studied something called the floor area ratio. The floor area ratio is 0.003 in this particular scene. It's extremely not dense. So one of the things is, if this is the place that potentially could introduce the most visitors to New Kent County, and the place where potentially a lot of counties do really well with these because of the meals and lodging taxes, you plan your interchanges to absorb the growth. It doesn't mean it has to be ugly. It can actually be quite welcoming. So in this photograph, what we've done is to overlay those yellow buildings are now shown in gray, and the red indicates with proper land use controls and zoning and things like that, how you can encourage growth at that particular spot. And so let's zoom in a little bit. First, there's a welcoming boulevard. You get that working. You place guidelines on where you can place buildings. There may be convenience parking up front, but the majority, employee parking, et cetera, is in the back. There's some central greens, not unlike the village and the hamlet. I think there's one's a dog park. There may be others that would work along in there. And then you show how to place these buildings so that you have plenty of parking. You have pedestrian connectivity. The smaller white lines here are crosswalks and sidewalks. And it's a lot of the very same principles that you're applying to the old villages and hamlets, but you're applying them to this new type of urban form. Okay, and then here's what it looks like from the air, and this, and of course with this is the same idea that you provide also opportunities for the land use regulations to prevent this from sprawling down the road. So you concentrate it right here in this particular area. This typical interchange without any kind of controls on it starts to look like this. And it's not only ugly, it's kind of dangerous because you can't read all these signs as you move through here. And just the most basic controls like planting and sidewalks and signage guidelines, etc., can tame this kind of place. Imagine that going one step further into working on the buildings and the land use guidelines, and you could really have quite a nice welcome into your county. So Interchange Character Board will be one of our products, and we'll discuss these kind of items on that board. With regard to your business park, a lot of the visual quality surveys, we were curious to find that most liked ones were the ones that didn't show the buildings. And so, I mean, you can take that and translate that into a pattern language for your business park. It might have a parkway corridor, place the buildings in the background, use natural resources as amenities like your mini streams and things like that, organize the parking, lighting, signage, include amenities like trails, include guidelines that say where the sign should go. And then finally, with your business park, think to include nearby support facilities. Like childcare is always a huge one near a business park, and other types of support facilities. Incentivize those so that it'll work. Now, all these things that we've been talking about have been intensifying development in key areas. One thing to think about is, if you look back at that map that we saw, the villages, the hamlets, the interstate interchange areas, etc., it's just a few percentage points of the land. 2 to 5% of the land is what we've been talking about. And intensifying that, what we're talking about, the other huge piece of the county is preserving the countryside. This needs as much attention as all the other things that we've been talking about. It has to be done at the same time. And you already have a very good system in place that you've started to really use. The ag forestal districts, it's a tremendous inventory of land that people have placed in the ag forestal districts, and it shows there's a lot of care already in this kind of rural preservation. Another map that comes out of your green infrastructure plan is all the areas that are very important to protect for the Chesapeake Bay. And so if you look at this green areas and the other green areas we just saw, most of the land in the county deserves some type of preservation and conservation. And so, and people tell us not only that, but they just love the scenery of the countryside. So if you start to really analyze why do they like that? Well, people tell us that they love the wide open views of the countryside, and that the countryside, the pastoral scenery, provides a sense of identity for your county. And when people go through this countryside, they see the big old trees and the forests and the pastures, and it gives them a visible tie to history and a visible tie to nature. And when they see the buildings, typical buildings in the countryside, reinforce that sense of history and nature. And people also tell us they like the quiet that they see that they find in the countryside. And so there are ways to help to strengthen that. I mean, a lot of counties in Virginia have countryside just by having good luck. Nobody has tried to develop those yet. Other counties have it because they put measures in place as they grow to start to protect that countryside. And so, for example, up near roads may be important to protect with some types of setbacks or scenery management system ideas. And so it's especially important, and here's one probably more of a priority area when you really start to think about this, is when New Kent considers extending utilities. This is just a little diagram, but here's a road, and the blue indicates, say, water or sewer line gets extended, usually along a roadway. So when the public utility corridor starts to go from this hamlet to this village, for example, there'll be a tremendous amount of pressure to allow other folks to hook on all along here. I know, why not? It's right along there. And so if you want to preserve that scenery, you maybe think strategically about using land use regulations to go along with that, like scenic easements along the utility corridor. Something to think about as you grow. And so as we transition from the strategic plan, which we're in, into the comprehensive plan, one of the big questions is going to be, well, how much of this growth that is planned for New Kent County can we absorb in these villages and hamlets? And another thing to remember is New Kent is already got a number of PUDs, which also have a number of home lots, which can help to offset the absorption over a number of years. So going forward, we would try to work this so that the home lots in the PUDs get absorbed, the villages, the hamlets, etc., thrive, and then there can be some, although less pressure would be on the development in other places. And to do that, it's going to require, as you go into the next phase, a more process-oriented land development process that really uses each site's resources in its own development. So to explain a little bit more about how that works and more of a specific prescription, really, as you move forward, is Evie, who will now, I'm handing you the microphone, Evie, so keep on moving and I'll click for you.
Okay, thank you, David. And thank you for all that great presentation and all those illustrations for these places potentially in New Kent County. So next slide. So one of the real key issues that we have been working on is what are the tools that the county can use to manage land development? And this is more or less a laundry list that a lot of Virginia planners use, and I'll go down some of these, but regulatory codes and tools that many communities use are your zoning ordinance and your subdivision ordinance. They also have overlay districts for special areas that are included in the zoning. And then sometimes they have targeted development areas such as established growth areas, urban development areas, or what planners refer to as UDAs, as well as service districts. And then many times design guidelines may be referenced in the zoning code and provide greater details on how development can be managed. So that first grouping is kind of your standard set of tools that planners use to really guide growth and development in our communities. But there are also some incentive-based tools that are used frequently in Virginia and in other states. These include things like conservation easements that might be applied to rural areas or special environmental areas. And these can be held by both public agencies, such as in Virginia, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, or maybe even by a private entity that, like a land trust. Purchase of development rights is also another program that many communities have used. And that type of a program will actually pay for the development rights in a particular area. And then sometimes that program is partnered with the transfer of development rights to another area. Now, New Kent County several years ago established in their comprehensive plan that they wanted to pursue the purchase of development rights. And they actually set up that in the county code, and that program is in existence, but has not really been activated to the point where they have actually purchased any development rights. And also that project had a small amount of initial funding, and it was actually counting on some additional funding from state governments. And so this is something maybe in the future, there perhaps is additional funding that might be available either through public agencies or maybe even private investors who are interested in conservation and really trying to further that. And then there are conservation tools. David's already talked about Chesapeake Bay zones, and you've seen that, as well as agricultural and forestal districts. And that agricultural and forestal district has really been working very, very well in New Kent County, and you could see that from the maps. Next. So I wanted to just show this, not for you all to be able to read it, because I know that it's a lot of text and it's very detailed, but I wanted to at least let you know that as a planning consultant, I did look at the existing zoning code for New Kent County and made a list of the various districts that you have and made some notes so that I could be well informed in recommending some perhaps some things that you might want to work on. Next. So in basically looking at your existing zoning ordinance, some of the things that you may want to consider that may help implement some of the development concepts and patterns that David has discussed, you might want to consider updating your zoning ordinance and amending it to include something simple like a historic district that regulates the architectural features of new development in that area and protects historic structures. And in the state of Virginia, it's important to note that in zoning, the only true way of being able to deal with architectural character or architectural details is through historic districts. There's also the ability to perhaps extend corridor overlay districts into those historic districts and actually establish standards for development that may occur along some of your historic entrances. You do have a conservation cluster subdivision provision in your existing code, and perhaps that can be updated to address some of the concepts that we have shared with you over the last couple of sessions. The standards for development in the existing code truly do need to be expanded. They are very minimal, and there are opportunities, I think, to perhaps add to some of those development standards for your existing development districts. And then in particular for the planned unit developments, that there should be some expanded requirements, especially with respect to mixed use. Many communities, what they will do is they will allow a planned unit development to take place, but they require a mixture of a certain percentage of commercial and a certain percentage of residential uses in order to be able to qualify for that district. And what happens is that enables you to be able to have a nicely planned subdivision, but you don't have to drive for 20 minutes to a local grocery store. Because perhaps there is a commercial cluster within that development that has a corner grocery or something on it. And then many communities are now putting into place what's called a form-based code. And there are pieces, what I think may be appropriate for New Kent County is to perhaps consider some pieces of a form-based code that you may mesh with your existing ordinance. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a form-based code. This is getting next. This is getting a little bit more detailed, but it's important for you to kind of understand that this is a new concept that many planners across the country are using, especially when they are trying to guide development in urban areas, but also manage development in rural areas. So what is a form-based code? And I have a definition from the form-based code organization, but it is essentially a tool that's used to achieve a community vision. And it focuses on the relationship between buildings and the public spaces, and it deals with things like building form, mass, and scale, and street types. But it deals with those in a very visual way, as well as some short words. It's not a text document like you usually have in a standard zoning code. And it actually guides and controls the intensity of development patterns rather than being focused on segregating the land uses. Next. So here's an example of a visual example of comparing a conventional zoning code with perhaps some design guidelines and a form-based code. So what you see is on the left, a conventional zoning code usually deals with the density of development on a parcel and setbacks and maybe maximum building heights. And if you add to that zoning a design guideline that is maybe referenced in the code, what happens is that perhaps you find out a little bit more about architectural qualities and detailing and windows and design features. But in a form-based code, what happens is that you end up with a lot of different building types and street types, and you actually are dealing more with forms and the relationship of those forms to one another to the public spaces. So you can see it's a whole lot more visual, and it deals with a whole lot more than just the standard block that you might deal with if you're dealing in zoning. Next. So at our last workshop, we introduced this transect diagram of development patterns. And this is something that planners frequently work with today, and it's usually associated with explaining a form-based code. However, it's very, very interesting to think about how the patterns shown in this transect diagram relate to New Kent County. So for instance, the T1 natural zone represents a lot of the more rural lands of your community and the very natural ones that are along all the rivers and open spaces that you have. And then you have a rural zone that is more of your countryside. Then you have a suburban zone, which really in New Kent is more of perhaps some of your subdivisions, maybe some of your planned unit developments. And then you get into a general urban zone, which also might be your urban planned unit developments and perhaps your villages and even your hamlets. But you right now you don't really have a T5 urban center zone, but you can see how this basically very simply relates how a community grows and that there are certain character districts that are very appropriate for a community. Next slide. So this is an example of a user-friendly form-based code where they have used graphics and minimal text to illustrate some of those transects. And so this is just an example of one that's dealing with how you build a single family house. And what's interesting about this is that I always feel that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is something that's very user-friendly and to the point, and you don't have to read through paragraphs and paragraphs of information to be able to get that kind of information. So a form-based code in a very friendly way may be an option for New Kent County, but I have to stress that it would be very important, I think, that whatever form-based code that or pieces that you want to consider, that it does need to be very, very simple. Next. So how do communities implement a form-based code? So there are a couple ways that you can consider integrating a form-based code into what you already have as far as a zoning code. And so you can basically replace the entire zoning code with a form-based code. And that's what many very urban communities have been doing. Or a lot of communities now are also doing what's called a hybrid zoning code, and it combines form-based districts with some of the standard districts that you have perhaps in your zoning ordinance now. And then there's even a third option where perhaps maybe within a specific district, you may allow a developer to use a form-based provision for in a particular area as an option. Next. So I wanted to go into the depth about the form-based code, not only to just kind of explain what that was, but to get you thinking about what this may mean for New Kent County. And so when you are when a community is developing a form-based code, they need to define a community vision, and they need to define character areas within the community. So think about what we are doing with this strategic plan. We have been talking about defining a community vision that talks about development patterns and rural conservation areas. We've also been talking about the specific character of things like a village, a hamlet, a rural crossroads, and even the rural countryside. And so some of these things, you are already in a position where you perhaps are thinking a little bit maybe about a form-based code, or perhaps in the future. And then after this project, what might happen is that you might assess and refine what those existing conditions are, what areas you might want to apply, and what those details are. And then you may want to think about your zoning districts. What are the transects that you want to represent? What are the use types? What are the building types? What are your street types? And then you may want to think about what are some of the architectural and landscaping standards that apply to each one of those. Next. So I wanted to share with you a similar community that's, well, it's not really a similar community. It's one that perhaps adopted a form-based code that, like New Kent, they wanted to preserve something very unique about their community. And so this is in Dafuskie Island, South Carolina. And they wanted to promote the unique heritage that they had, as well as the pedestrian development patterns. And so what happened is that they started by looking at areas where they wanted to focus on growth. So we've talked about that this evening or this afternoon in terms of villages, hamlets, and crossroads. It's a highly illustrated document, and it does include development standards and architectural guidelines. Next. And so look at this. This is just a cut sheet. And at the bottom half of this cut sheet, look at the types of places that they have talked about, hamlets and villages. So I'm not suggesting that this is something that you can replicate exactly, but it is at least a community that has adopted a code that at least reflects some of the place types that we have talked about over the last couple of weeks. Next. And so here is a final illustration where they have actually identified where those hamlets and villages and crossroads basically exist within their community. And then they have partnered that with a description of what those places are and what the sizes are to manage the growth. And then there, in addition to that, there are additional standards that talk about what the specific characteristics about how that pattern is to be developed. Next. So so I presented all of this so that you all can be thinking about it. It is simply an example of how you in the future can move forward with trying to manage growth. So let's think about the strategic plan and some of the strategies that perhaps we want to have come out of today's discussion and our work over the past several months. And what we've heard are perhaps that it's to celebrate New Kent's unique community identity and to put density in places that can accommodate development so that you can preserve the rural character of the remaining part of the community that's so very important to you. And then we've talked about each place. It's very important to be able to have an intentional design character. There's a difference between what a village looks like, what a hamlet looks like, and what a crossroads looks like. And then to really think in terms of concentrating the utilities and the public amenities and distributing those within those growth areas so that they're able to serve all people across the county. And then finally, to think about accompanying regulations that is going to manage and direct that growth. And that's the purpose of the strategic plan, is to really think about what are the steps that you need to take to be able to implement the vision that this project is working on. Next. So at this point, David and I and perhaps Aaron would be willing to answer any questions that you may have, but I also want to point out that we can continue the discussion. So we have a Facebook page that has a lot of information posted to it about this project and where we've been and comments. We also have established over the last 2 weeks a virtual design studio page that has all of these presentations recorded, along with additional information that you might be able to look at your leisure. And so with that, we'll just kind of open it up for some questions, and I'll let you, Aaron, kind of take it from here, and we'll just kind of all three be available to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, David and Evie. We do have 3 really good questions that came in. And so the first one comes in, excuse me, comes in from Chris Goebel. What roles do we see for proven conservation techniques such as purchase of development rights, identifying potential funding sources, for example, revenues from Colonial Downs, a reinvigorated role for New Kent County's PDR committee, Purchase of Development Rights Committee, working with the county in identifying and prioritizing areas for preservation, conservation, development, and conservation easements, in implementing the evolving strategic plan, and of course the ensuing comp planning update process and any other future efforts. Evie, you touched on this in the presentation, but certainly put that back out there if there's anything else you'd like to add.
And what was the first part of the question? He has a lot of information in that question. So it's like, what is the reality of being able to do that?
I think he's asking about what we see as the potential for purchase of development rights, maybe with using revenues from Colonial Downs to help fund that, but also sort of reinvigorating the PDR committee that exists in New Kent County to help us achieve some of this vision that we've laid out here.
Well, I certainly think that as a result of this strategic plan and the development patterns that we have discussed, that we have emphasized the need to be able, if you want to achieve the vision, we have shared with people why rural conservation is important. So I think the timing is right to begin additional discussion with the PDR committee and the and county government, and to look at potential funding sources and partners. You know, the partners can be private partners as well. And many times Land trusts are established, community land trusts, and they've been very, very successful in these PDRs. So it's a matter of really, I think that the importance of preserving rural character and using PDRs is very evident now. It's a matter of working through that, and the timing, I think, is right.
And I'll add to that too. I mean, the great thing I think from New Kent County's perspective is, a lot of times when that is brought up, that concept is foreign. It's not here. You all have already identified that as an option, and it certainly is a tool that could be used in helping with many of the things that we've identified here. Next two questions both come from Charles Caro. First one is, in many of the concepts that we share today, we have buildings that are shown very close to the road, with the rural area, the ag and forestal area behind. Some planners criticize this as piano key type development, where from the road, all you see are the buildings, not the open space that is hidden behind. And his question is, wouldn't rural character be better preserved with bigger setbacks?
Evie, if you like, I can address that. And I think our questioner is really starting to grapple with this. You're exactly right. Rural character, the rural parts of this, you would want big setbacks, but you want to cluster your development in tiny areas, and on those you would have the setbacks are actually counterproductive. So the contrast between the dense villages, hamlets, crossroads, and that rural character, we need to get into that fine grain of where we draw those lines. So I think the question is absolutely valid, right on. Both of these questions have been totally right on. It's sort of next step. Where do you start the setback, and when do you have the build to?
Yeah. All right. And then the final question, also from Charles, is, should villages and hamlets be developed around the existing PUDs?
Again, I think this is great, because we're starting to push the very next question, which would be the comprehensive plan. And I believe in today's conversation, we've really focused on these particular land use types. As we move forward, we need to go back and look at New Kent and its particular situation. It has, I believe, there are 7 or so PUDs that are enormous, really. And that's a unique situation as well. So, the PUDs they're already a land use that are there. So we really haven't talked about them much today, because we're talking about new land uses. And one of the things that has been brought to our attention is, how do you better integrate the things we're talking about with the PUDs, just like I think he's brought up here. So is there, for example, are there crossroads near PUDs where you could start to develop a kind of a front door? These are the next step questions, which I think really are important for us to start to address, and not have these things, either you're one or the other. There may be a way to integrate these quite nicely. We just haven't looked at that level of detail yet.
I think, David, and another thing that we have discussed in the past is that there is a lot of density still to be built out in those PUDs, and you can kind of respond to that number a lot better than I can. But also, those PUDs do not have the commercial center and the core and the activity spaces that the villages that we need in villages to really make those special places. So you can't just basically take a PUD or a planned unit development and make it a village. And the villages that I believe that are that have been identified in the existing comprehensive plan on the future land use map were areas that were communities that they felt that those communities were going to grow with those commercial centers. So again, I think you've pointed out too that The county will be responsible for updating its comprehensive plan and really looking at a more detailed level at the future land use. That's why you do an update to the comprehensive plan. And I think what our study has done is to visualize what some of those places would be and how you can guide those to create a sense of place and to accommodate growth in the county so that you can preserve the rural environment around some of these places.
All right. Well, those were the three questions that we had, and I'll just go ahead and wrap up and talk about next steps for those that are with us here. As was mentioned earlier, where we are right now with the strategic plan, this is still a work in progress. And it's also, as Evie was just mentioning, it's also a building block for future efforts. You know, we are working through this project with you all to establish what that vision for New Kent County is. And then the question there is, you know, what do we need to do with our tools to continue that and implement that? And a lot of that is still to come, certainly. But again, with the strategic plan, it's still a work in progress. We're going to leave this video and the other videos up on Facebook for additional viewing, for folks who couldn't make it, as well as additional input. We're going to work this community design vision into the overall goals and objectives. David had mentioned at the very beginning the different themes that we have been working on in this plan, of which this touched on a couple of those. We're going to work the fruits of these last 2 weeks into those goals and objectives. So keep following the Facebook page. We're going to share the vision statement that the committee has been working on and allow you all to have an opportunity to look at it and provide input. We're also going to share the goals that we have been developing for you all to react to, of which, again, this will be part of that. And then ultimately, we will move into creating strategies for the community to work through to implement this vision. So, and again, we'll share those with you when we get to that point. So stay tuned for that. The Facebook page is where you'll get that information. So keep following the Facebook page. And with that, I would just like to say thank you so much for your attention today and these last 2 weeks. And we hope you have a great 4th of July. Thank you.